On day one of the St. Louis Rapid and Blitz, part of the 2017 Grand Chess Tour, Garry Kasparov sat down with the white pieces to face off against fellow Russian Sergey Karjakin. And after a friendly Russian schoolboy handshake, Mike rings the bell, whoever Mike is, and the game is off. E4, and after E5, we get the biggest surprise of the entire event so far, Garry Kasparov playing the King's Gambit. Research tells me that the only time Garry Kasparov ever played the King's Gambit was when he was forced to do so by the organizers in an exhibition match against Nigel Short. He lost that game and was very unhappy. He then plays knight to c3, which is, to follow up the King's Gambit, another surprise, as it's a very rare line. Moves knight f3, d4, and bishop to c4 are all much more common in these positions. So clearly Garry Kasparov came prepared to surprise his fellow Russian schoolboy, and Sergey Karjakin is going to take a moment to think about it before playing the most principled move, queen to h4 check. Now, after Kasparov almost immediately plays the move king to e2, we will note that knight to c6 instead of queen h4 by Sergey is actually the most common line. Perhaps where Kasparov put a little more prep, but I wouldn't be surprised if he dove deeply into queen h4, as anytime you have a chance to play a move like queen h4 check on move 3 and destroy your opponent's right to castle, it's pretty hard not to go for that. But this is when it gets interesting. What you can tell from Sergey Karjakin's posture and the fact that he's taking a lot of time here in a blitz game is that he already smells a rat, right? Garry Kasparov has never played the King's Gambit in tournament chess, and then he plays a rare line to go with that with knight to c3. Rather than dive into what is probably going to be the most complicated theory with principled moves like d5 or d6, Sergey plays the move queen back to d8. This voluntary retreat that you just saw him do really makes a lot of sense, because the queen says, you know what, I've already done my job, I gave a check, I've destroyed this king's right to castle, let me get out of the fray and avoid future tempos. Kasparov, still being confident in his approach, plays d4, which of course is the most principled move, exactly what you do in a King's Gambit. You sacrifice the f-pawn for the potential of this big center here, and you hope to use that as compensation as you regain the pawn. But now again, Sergey took some time to think, as you just saw there, before playing the move knight f6. Once again, not the most obvious or principled move. In my analysis here, you can click the link in the show notes. I actually analyze this game in detail, and you can go to Chess.com and see all of it. I said once again that d5, this idea where you strike back in the center and you try to create equal play in terms of both sides getting pieces that come out quickly, because you know white's going to get activity for the King's Gambit. That's normally what you see. And after moves like e takes d5, sometimes you even see moves like c6, a further sacrifice so that black might accelerate development. This is, as I've said in the notes, the principled thing that you normally see people do against the King's Gambit, is to strike back and try to equalize in terms of activity. But Karjakin, after playing queen h4 check, he retreats the queen to avoid theory, and then once again, I think very smartly, played the move knight f6 and sort of puts the question to Garry, are you really ready to justify and play a King's Gambit here if I'm not going to fall into your preparation? And that's what Kasparov is thinking about right now. I'm not going to get the lines that probably were the most deeply prepared after moves like d5. Not to say d5 would have been bad, but it would have been where Kasparov put most of his effort. So he decides, okay, well, I'm obviously, I need to regain my pawn, so I'm going to play bishop takes f4. And here, now we get the first moment where probably d5 is no longer the best move. If Karjakin had gone for it now, Kasparov can take with the knight, and the key point is that now the bishop and knight would actually line up here for an attack, preventing moves like knight takes e4. And so if a variation like knight takes d5 would occur, some natural moves would show that black actually doesn't get a lot against the king. White can solidify, sort of prepare to bring the rook to e1, maybe get castled by hand. So at this point, I think the d5 ship, so to speak, has sailed. And Karjakin realizes that. He doesn't go for d5 and instead plays the move you just saw him play, which is, of course, bishop to b4. Another principled move, it develops a piece. It undermines the protection of the e4 pawn by attacking this knight. You are reminding white that something has to be dealt with here. Of course, bishop to b4 also simply prepares to get castled, right? Let's get the king out of the center. This is a King's Gambit after all. King's safety first. My rule's always been safety third, but that's a whole nother story. So as Kasparov thinks here, he has to find ways to defend e4. The most natural ways to do it are either to bring the queen out or to try to pin this knight. Bringing the queen out is certainly not a bad idea when you think that it tries to complete development, But after moves like castles, and as you're going to see in a couple moments where white had a chance to do it again, I think that the queen is sort of awkward here. It's awkward on diagonals, potentially. It's awkward on the e4 file, if tactics occur there. So Kasparov kind of agrees with that and decides to defend e4 dynamically by playing bishop to g5, which defends the pawn, of course, because now taking it would lose the queen. Karjakin doesn't have to be asked twice to eliminate an active minor piece and double white's pawns in the process. I think this is 100% correct, and in analysis you can already see that we are heading a direction where you start to like black's position. The reason I say that is because white is clearly not getting the sharpest type of lines you would get in a king's gambit. Normally you're seeing pieces with super accelerated development. White would almost rather be down another pawn or a piece at this point with chances for an attack, rather than have a position that's basically equal with this king sitting like a sore thumb on e2. Now after black castles, and threats of taking on e4 will continue to come with things like rook e8, Kasparov decides he needs to eliminate that knight with bishop takes f6, but after queen takes f6 and the move king to f2, we're going to get our first moment of the game where Karjakin really shows that he now feels he's better, he's the one pressing for an advantage, and it's not a coincidence that it comes right after white voluntarily gives up the bishop pair on f6, and with it all natural protection of the dark squares. So what exactly does black do here? Well, he plays the move c5, right? Makes a lot of sense, of course, to play the move c5. He's lining up the queen on the dark squares and preparing for basically any opening of the position at this point is going to awkwardly expose white's biggest weaknesses. Now, Kasparov plays h3, which prevents the move bishop to g4. That makes sense, as this knight is kind of an important piece to defending this. Karjakin plays rook to e8. After that, we saw the move, or we're about to see the move queen to d3, as now there's no longer a way to defend the pawn by eliminating a knight. The queen needs to join the fray. And all natural evaluations of this position have us, as I said, still liking black from the perspective that white did not achieve any overly dynamic, overwhelming threats for justifying the king's gambit. Black is going to have long-term advantages on the dark squares, and if white doesn't find the right way to get activity and coordinate, it's only a matter of black getting developed and getting all the pieces into the game before those become weaknesses. And white also lacks a little bit of a concrete plan. Here Sergey plays the first move that I sort of criticized in my analysis with b6. I felt like this was slow, and as you can see from the link below, I didn't see any reason why knight to c6 is not just clearly the most natural thing to do and maybe develop rapidly and just try to get play on the c file. But he plays b6, which, okay, it makes sense to try to bring the bishop to this diagonal. After white defended the e-pawn, Sergey decided bishop a6 was no longer that good. I'll just develop more naturally and put pressure on b7. And with the natural move still coming, certainly black has not lost his slight edge. I just felt that b6 was maybe slower than it needed to be. But white is still left with some tough questions. I can't play bishop e2 because the e4 pawn hangs, right? We have two people on it. If I can't play bishop e2, then I can't fully complete my development, so I have to find another route to develop the bishop here on f1, which is exactly what the 13th world champion is thinking about right now. And you know, we see some natural grimaces, which I don't think are acting here or faces to try to intimidate his opponent. I think Kasparov, genuinely a little bit frustrated here, has to play g3. Black's moves are so much more natural. Bring a knight out, I'm attacking d4. White plays bishop g2. But all of the tension roads in this position favor black. And what we mean by that is, can white ever play d5 without opening up this horrible and awesome outpost square for black? No. Can white ever take without opening up obvious roads to these now doubled and isolated pawns? No. So as black plays this natural move rook a to c8, and because of the threat of capturing and then knight to b4, which would be a fork on the queen and the pawn, Kasparov plays a3, but you can see that if you're having to play sort of passive, single move defensive measures against a threat, you've obviously lost the thread. There's no initiative here to be claimed by white at all, and it's really up for Karjakin here to think about how he wants to proceed. He finds a really strong move here, knight to b8. I noted that probably a natural move like rook to c7, just sort of doubling rooks and kind of saying, you know, I can prepare to bring pressure on the c file, is probably also good enough for an edge. But knight to b8 is a dual threat. It prepares things like bishop a6, a relocation of the knight where I will still have e5, and more aggressively open the c-file. Kasparov plays rook e3, which makes sense. The rook is sort of prophylactically guarding a whole bunch of stuff here, and white knows he's on the defensive. Karjakin continues to relocate, and after knight to d7, rook to f1. Not immediately threatening any sort of discovery against the queen, but Karjakin isn't interested in sitting around anyway. He's going to relocate the queen, get off that file, and create an overwhelming battery here against the e4 pawn. And again, to summarize where we've come from the start to here, we had this incredibly exciting and surprising start by Kasparov with the King's Gambit, but since the younger Russian anticipated and smelt a rat in terms of preparation and played these awkward queen d8, knight f6 approaches, I don't think we've seen anything but a downhill slope right now, and a rather slippery one for white. Yes, white just completes castles, but it comes at the price of this pawn. Kasparov quickly plays queen e2, and in Blitz you think, all right, well, there's got to be some dynamic chances here. He's down a pawn, but there's a whole bunch of pins. But the truth is, not much. Karjakin plays d5, as you just saw him play, supporting the bishop and saying, I've won a pawn, and the exchange rate is still the same, whether in Russia or America. Knight h4 is a nice move. It opens up the bishop to hit e4 and maybe threatens knight f5, but Karjakin correctly defends the more annoying of those two threats, just with g6. Says, I'm not going to allow the knight to come to f5 where I can't take it. And even though Kasparov is able to trade on e4, that's a mouse slip by me, even though he's able to trade on e4, he's not able to continue to capture because, of course, the pawn has enough defense. Queen to g4 comes in with threats of knight f5, knight f6. We're going to get a good little sort of Russian tickle here, little knight f6, knight h5 here, but like any good Russian schoolboy, Karjakin is repeating moves with zero intention of taking a perpetual, and as he just slams down knight to g7, he's reminding Kasparov he knows he's up at least a full point here. Of course, he would know the engine eval, but black is easily on his way to winning this position. And the nature of this game should be taking on one now where Kasparov is on his way to losing a blitz game. He backs up the queen. Karjakin takes on d4, supports the e4 pawn, and then brings a queen to the battery. That attacked d4, which forced c3, and that's how the a3 pawn fell as the rook's defense was cut off. These moves are going to be happening pretty rapidly now as black brings out the knight to e6, and we're seeing a lot of exchanges happen. But this was really the critical moment. When g4 was played, Karjakin should have taken on g4 first and then played knight to g5, rather than allowing this counterplay that comes with this exchange sacrifice. On the board, what you can see now is a pretty complicated situation where, yes, of course, black was still totally winning after queen to e7. Kasparov sort of shakes his head and slides the queen over, knowing that this is really just an all-in kind of gambit. But an all-in gambit nonetheless, after queen g5, rook g3, king h2, we get the final critical moment right here, right now, where Kasparov brings down the hammer under time pressure with knight takes g6. This exchange and all these moves are happening with such little time on the clock that Karjakin doesn't know that he's already actually blown the win with this last move, queen to d2 check. We're going to let these guys play out these final moves here, as we're going to see Karjakin's frustration literally living off the delay with 0 seconds on the clock, moves continuing to be played here. He brings the queen all the way to the edge before realizing there's no diagonal that's going to help him. He goes back to a1, going to come back to b2, going to sort of play an inchworm game here and bring the queen all the way back to the center of the board. But Kasparov is smartly avoiding all of the potentially losing squares, the mind bomb squares, right? And we're going to see exactly that right here, as Karjakin has no time to think about it. He wishes he did. He almost loses on time there, dropping the piece, and you hear those words, ni-cha, which is, of course, the draw, and the game is agreed. And so what exactly happened there in regards to the critical moment? Why did Karjakin blow the win? Well, if we back up to this position right here, after the move knight takes g6, which was a super practical and shows why the 13th world champion is who he is. Now, it's a lost position for white, don't get me wrong. But after rook takes g3, queen takes g3, you wouldn't feel as black that you're already in a position where there's really kind of an only move on the board, but indeed that is the case. Queen to d2 check loses the ability for this queen to get on the proper diagonals to provide defense against the perpetual. The move queen to c6 check was winning for black, and the main reason is that the king can't move, as now the queen is in a perfect position to just take back the knight. There's no perpetual anymore. Black is up a rook, and Bob's your uncle for Garry. Now, d5 would have been the trick that would have kept the game going, but the key is the same idea now happens where the queen is going to capture this pawn and enter the perpetual roads, but the difference is that now with that pawn gone, this queen can work her way to the proper diagonal of a1 to h8, allowing the knight to eventually be captured because queen takes g6 is met by queen to g7. You can see with no time on the clock why that would be absolutely so difficult for Karjakin to find. So really hard to begrudge him, and a lot of credit goes to Garry for finding this really just practical and intuitively. He just knew he was up against the gun. He finds this saving resource. Of course, Karjakin was winning, but without enough time, he plays a move that seems natural, but unfortunately, the moment this happened, the game is already a draw. And again, part of the reason for that is that as long as Garry doesn't touch the mine squares, he goes to the dark squares, which is correct. If he had gone to h1, once again, we would have had an opportunity for this queen to correctly put herself on a better diagonal, and in this case, it's because when the king moves, now that the queen is not susceptible to any sort of devastating discovered check, black can play the move rook to f7. Any sort of discovered check by the knight would allow rook to g7, and black once again would have gone on to win. So Kasparov doesn't make that mistake even with no time on the clock, correctly avoids all the mind bomb squares, as I said, the losing squares, and eventually, as you saw in this video, a whole bunch of checks, a whole lot of nothing, and eventually we got a draw. So super interesting game, very, very dynamic save by the 13th world champion. I'm sure he regrets the King's Gambit. I doubt we'll be seeing that in any more Blitz appearances by Garry Kasparov, if we see any. Despite the really, really well-played practical approach, avoiding Garry's preparation by Karjakin, he was unable to come up with the full point. Really fun stuff. Hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a comment. Let us know what you think about the format. Appreciate you watching. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel.